A cold October night in 1859, a strange passenger train rolled into the small Kentucky town of Milford, its windows glowing like tired eyes. People at the station watched in silence as the cars arrived full, every seat taken, but not a single voice inside. No movement, no sound, not even a whisper of life. And when that same train pulled out minutes later, it left completely empty, as if the passengers had vanished into the night. Tell me, what kind of train arrives full of people and leaves with none? At first, townspeople tried to convince themselves it was nothing, a misunderstanding, a trick of the dim lantern light. But the station workers knew better. They saw the still bodies in Sattert's side, sitting upright as if frozen in place, eyes half open, skin pale as chalk. Whatever rode into Milford that night was not simply a train of travelers. It was a warning, a silent message carried in steel and shadow, and no one dared to speak it aloud. Here on Shadows of True History, we gather the bravest souls, the ones unafraid to look into the darker corners of the past. So tell me, do you have the courage to follow this truth where it leads? If you do, subscribe and comment your location below. Let me know where you're joining this investigation from. Kentucky in 1859 was a land caught between two worlds, the old and the coming storm. Small towns like Milford lived quiet, predictable lives, shaped by tobacco fields, river trade, and the slow rhythm of horse-drawn wagons on dirt roads. People trusted what they could see, what they could touch, and what had been true for generations. But even in peaceful places, shadows can take root, unnoticed at first, growing quietly until they can no longer be ignored. And that year, the shadows were spreading. Travelers spoke of strange disappearances along the old trade routes. Telegraph operators whispered about messages arriving incomplete, as if someone or something had interrupted them mid-sentence. Even the rail lines, still relatively new, carried rumors faster than cargo. Milford sat along one of these growing rail networks. The townsfolk had welcomed the train line with hope, believing it would bring prosperity, news, connection, a doorway to the wider world. But as progress rolled in on steel tracks, I must say, so did a tension people couldn't quite explain. Animals grew restless on nights when the train passed. Lamps flickered for no reason, and more than once travelers arriving in town complained of cold spots inside certain train cars, as if someone unseen had brushed against them. They didn't know it yet, but the land itself had started to hold its breath. In those days, the Louisville and Southern Rail Company was led by men who carried themselves with quiet authority, men the public trusted without question. At the center of it all stood Silas Wexler, the company's chief operations director. On the surface, Silas looked like the kind of man people admired. Tall, composed, always dressed in a crisp dark suit that never seemed to wrinkle. He spoke softly, politely, and with the kind of confidence that made people believe he had nothing to hide. Women in town often said he had an honest face, but anyone who looked a second longer might have noticed something else, a stillness in his eyes, an unsettling calm that felt more like calculation than kindness. Silas was not alone. His closest partners, Jonas Creed and Marshall Dunn, were known as the iron hands behind the railroad's expansion. Jonas, with his sharp jaw and clipped speech, was a man who seemed to measure every word before releasing it. Marshall, heavier and slower in his movements, rarely spoke at all. Together, the three formed a quiet but unshakable triangle of influence. They were respected, admired even, yet no one truly knew what they discussed behind closed doors. And here's the part that should make you pause. Every one of these men was present the night that fateful train rolled into Milford, standing calmly on the platform, watching with unreadable expressions as the silent passengers sat frozen behind the glass. When questions began to rise about the strange train that arrived full and left empty, Silas Wexler and his men were ready with an explanation so calm, so logical, that most townspeople accepted it without a second thought. Silas stepped forward with that steady voice of his and assured everyone that what they had witnessed was nothing more than an equipment transfer. According to him, the passengers seen inside were mannequins, part of a new safety demonstration the company was preparing for major cities along the line. He spoke of training protocols, evacuation drills, and public education initiatives, using phrases so official-sounding that they created a kind of fog around the truth. And people believed him. Why wouldn't they? Silas was trusted. The railroad was the pride of the region. Most folks had never even seen a mannequin before, so when someone in power told them the word, they nodded along, grateful, even relieved, because the alternative would have been too frightening to consider. But a few details didn't match the story. The bodies inside the train had not looked like mannequins. Their skin had texture, their clothing was rumpled, and station workers could swear they saw the faintest condensation on the windows near their faces, the kind that only forms from warm breath meeting cold glass. Still, Silas smiled, tipped his hat, and promised there was nothing to fear, and somehow that smile was enough for a while. Beneath the polished exterior of the railroad, hidden from the eyes of the public, there was a system designed for efficiency. But in the wrong hands, efficiency can become something far darker. The Louisville and Southern Rail Company wasn't just a transportation line, it was a network of controlled routes, locked storage cars, and secret compartments that only a select few knew existed. Silas, Jonas, and Marshall had spent years building it, meticulously engineering each car so that it could conceal, transport, and manipulate without detection. Every latch, every hidden panel, every reinforced steel door had a purpose that no ordinary worker would question. These weren't mistakes or idle inventions. They were designed to control lives. Once a passenger, or anyone unfortunate enough to be chosen, was inside the train, the infrastructure ensured there was no escape. Whispers among the few who knew hinted at mechanisms that isolated individuals, sounds dampened so no cries could be heard outside. The train itself became a moving chamber of secrets, a vessel carrying more than just cargo or passengers. It carried fate, wrapped tightly in wood and iron. Even more terrifying was the knowledge that this hidden system could be activated at any station, in any town. And yet, on that October night in 1859, when the train rolled quietly into Milford, the infrastructure worked flawlessly. Every passenger, every secret compartment, every steel latch obeyed the unseen will of the men who controlled it. It was perfect, it was silent, and it left the town holding its breath. When local authorities arrived the next day, they were eager to soothe the growing unease among the townspeople. Sheriff Caleb Trenton, a man respected for his long service and calm demeanor, stood at the station and offered an explanation that sounded logical enough to quiet the whispers. "Nothing unusual occurred last night," he announced. "The train was part of a routine cargo transfer. The shadows, the silence, likely just a trick of the night and overactive imaginations." His words carried weight because he, too, was trusted. The townspeople wanted to believe him. After all, no one could reconcile the sight of seated, frozen passengers disappearing in minutes with any ordinary train activity. And so they nodded politely, even as their stomachs twisted with doubt. Merchants returned to their shops, children went back to school, and mothers whispered reassurances to one another over simmering pots. Yet, behind closed doors, questions festered. How could every person vanish so quickly? Why did the windows appear fogged as if by warm breath, only to clear with the train's departure? Even seasoned travelers, those who rode trains daily, found themselves second-guessing what they had seen. Silas Wexler's calm explanations and the sheriff's authoritative statements created a barrier around the truth, a wall of reason that seemed insurmountable. But for those who noticed the smallest inconsistencies, a chill remained. Something was very wrong in Milford, and the answers were far from official. No sinister plan can unfold without someone willing to aid it from the inside, and in Milford, that person was Harold Greaves, a quiet, unassuming conductor who had worked the line for nearly a decade. On the surface, Harold was polite, diligent, and seemingly devoted to his duties. He knew every car, every schedule, every secret nook of the trains. But beneath his calm exterior lay a man who had been carefully courted, persuaded, and perhaps even frightened into complicity. Harold was present on that October night, guiding passengers, or what appeared to be passengers, into the train with methodical precision. His hands, steady and practiced, closed doors that would never open again. He witnessed the fear in the few who glanced at him with questioning eyes, and yet he said nothing. For Harold, silence was safety, obedience was survival. And while the townspeople saw only a familiar face behind the ticket counter, Harold had become a critical link in a chain that no outsider could break. Later, whispers would circulate of the small gestures that betrayed his role: a hand on a latch, a nod in a corridor, a whispered warning that went unheeded. Though he appeared invisible in the grand scheme, without him, the train's grim design could not have succeeded. The quiet man at the helm ensured that the horrors hidden within the railroad's infrastructure unfolded smoothly, leaving the town of Milford none the wiser, and yet forever changed. The passengers who boarded that train in Milford were not criminals, not adventurers, not anyone who might have expected danger. They were everyday people: farmers returning from market, mothers with children in tow, merchants carrying letters and coins, and laborers whose lives revolved around predictable routines. Each carried hopes and small worries, dreams they hoped to see realized, and burdens they had learned to shoulder silently. To them, the train was a simple conveyance, a bridge between towns, a passage to something familiar. And yet that very normalcy made them targets. The train did not select by wealth, status, or notoriety. It selected by opportunity. It sought those who could vanish quietly, whose absence could be explained or overlooked for weeks, months, or even years. It was deliberate, calculated, and cruel in its precision. The victims had no idea they were stepping into a moving tomb. They only trusted the world they had always known. Some would later be described by townspeople as cheerful, unremarkable, ordinary, and yet their ordinariness was exactly what drew the attention of those orchestrating the horror. They had lives worth noting, faces worth remembering, and stories worth erasing. Each chair they sat in, each breath they took, became a prelude to disappearance. Milford would never fully comprehend what had happened that night, and the memory of the people who vanished would linger in empty chairs, abandoned clothing, and the faint, unexplainable shadows on the station floor. No plan is ever truly invisible, and for the men behind the train, that night in Milford had a flaw. Eleanor Hargrove, a young seamstress known for her curiosity, had arrived early at the station. Eleanor had come to deliver a parcel to a friend traveling north, her eyes wide with excitement and nerves. She had no business noticing what she did, yet from the corner of the platform she saw it all: the pale, unmoving passengers, the careful, precise movements of Harold Greaves, and the unreadable faces of the railroad men overseeing it. Eleanor froze. Fear gripped her chest, cold and sharp, but a strange compulsion kept her rooted to the spot. Her mind tried to reconcile what she saw: people who looked alive, sitting upright, yet utterly silent, as if suspended between reality and some other dimension. And then the train's doors closed, the whistle blew, and the cars began to move. In that moment, Eleanor realized with a deep, gnawing certainty that the train was leaving Milford empty, that those inside would never step back onto the platform. For Eleanor, it was a moment that changed everything. She became the unintended observer of a horror no one would believe. And even as the train disappeared into the night, she understood the risk she carried, knowing too much, witnessing too clearly, and now being a target herself. Eleanor Hargrove returned home that night with her hands trembling and her mind racing. The streets of Milford felt different, darker, heavier, as though the town itself had absorbed the weight of what she had seen. Every shadow seemed to stretch longer, every creak of a floorboard sounded like a warning. She tried to tell her mother, to speak of the empty train and the frozen passengers, but the words faltered on her lips. How could she explain something that defied reason? How could she articulate horror that felt like a living presence, lingering in the corners of the station long after the train had gone? When she finally attempted to recount the events to neighbors and friends, the response was immediate: skepticism, disbelief, and gentle, patronizing reassurances that she must have been imagining things. "It's late, Eleanor. one woman said. "You must have been tired or frightened by the dark." Even the town's authorities, when Eleanor tried to approach them, offered little more than polite dismissal. The sheriff assured her it was all routine, just a cargo train, child, nothing to fear. But Eleanor knew the truth, and that knowledge became a burden she could not shake. Sleep refused her, nightmares clawed at her consciousness, and every passing train brought a shiver that ran through her very bones. The disbelief of others only intensified her isolation, turning what she had witnessed into a secret she carried alone. Each day she saw familiar faces in the crowd, wondering if anyone else had noticed, questioning who among them might already be complicit. By the end of that week, Eleanor realized a terrible fact. In Milford, knowing the truth was a danger in itself, and survival might depend on her silence. When word of the strange train reached the higher-ups in Louisville, the company acted swiftly, but with a careful show of concern rather than truth. A formal inquiry was launched, ostensibly to investigate the reports of missing passengers. Teams of auditors and inspectors arrived, notebooks in hand, clipboards at the ready, giving the appearance of rigorous oversight. For most townspeople, this display was convincing. Reports would be written, statements collected, and everything would be looked into, but the real purpose was not investigation, it was control. The inquiry was carefully scripted to fail. Inspectors were guided to the standard areas, told to check schedules, manifests, and mechanical logs. They saw the train cars, the seats, and the empty compartments, and yet they found nothing unusual. Any hint of discomfort or question from the investigators was quietly redirected by company men, often with a polite smile and the familiar reassuring tone of, "There's nothing to see here." Even the small-town officials were subtly warned. Exaggeration could bring legal trouble, skepticism could damage reputations. The machinery of deception ran smoothly, and the company's authority went largely unchallenged. Meanwhile, Eleanor Hargrove watched from the shadows, knowing she was the only one who could truly testify to what had happened. Yet her voice alone could not pierce the veil of orchestrated plausibility. The official inquiry offered townspeople and outsiders a reason to relax, to believe that routine procedures explained the inexplicable. In reality, it was a masterclass in plausible deniability, the appearance of action without any real accountability, allowing the horror to continue unchecked and the guilty to maintain their calm, untroubled lives. Though the official narrative claimed there was nothing unusual, some survivors, if they could even be called that, returned altered, carrying marks of their ordeal that no one could explain. A few passengers had inexplicably reappeared weeks later along distant stretches of the rail line, their clothing torn, eyes haunted, voices trembling with a fear they could not articulate. They did not speak of where they had been. Words seemed impossible, as if the truth had been etched into their bodies and minds rather than their mouths. Townspeople noticed their distant gazes, the occasional shiver, the sudden flinch at the sound of a train whistle. These living echoes of the train's dark passage were warnings, a mirror of what could have happened or might yet happen. Eleanor Hargrove observed them carefully. She could see the subtle changes. A mother who once hummed softly now walked silently, clutching her child as though expecting something unseen. A merchant who had laughed easily now stared at the ground, shaking slightly when reminded of the station. Even a young laborer who had been full of energy moved with a caution that bordered on paranoia. Each survivor became a ghost in plain sight, a vessel of memory that could not be denied, yet could not be fully explained. The railroad men dismissed these changes publicly as stress or illness, but Eleanor and a handful of perceptive observers knew better. Every altered passenger was living proof of the train's sinister power, a tangible link to a horror no official report could contain. And as the months passed, Eleanor realized something chilling. Even those who returned were forever bound to the secret, walking reminders that some doors, once open, can never truly be closed. It was not random. The disappearances, the altered survivors, the eerie perfection of the train's empty departure all followed a methodical pattern that hinted at cold calculation. Silas Vexler and his associates had engineered the entire operation with precision that could almost be described as scientific, though the science was twisted and merciless. They had studied human behavior, noting reactions to confined spaces, fear, and isolation. They understood how people respond to authority, how easily a well-timed gesture or whispered command can suppress resistance. The train itself was a laboratory on wheels, each compartment a controlled environment, each latch and panel a tool for manipulation. Harold Greaves, the conductor, was the operator applying these principles with unerring consistency. Passengers were seated according to a pattern that maximized compliance and minimized the risk of case. Warmth, light, and sound were subtly adjusted to disorient. Every whistle, every click of steel on track was calibrated to maintain control. Even the smallest details, where a passenger's hand rested, the angle of their chair, the momentary flash of lantern light, were part of a larger scheme. Eleanor Hargrove began piecing together what she saw. She realized the train was not just a vehicle, it was a meticulously designed instrument of psychological and physical domination. Every element served a purpose, creating fear, confusion, and ultimately submission. There was no randomness, no luck, only the precise execution of a plan that silenced lives and hid them from the world. The horror lay not in chance, but in the deliberate intelligence behind it. And for those who understood it, the truth was almost unbearable. Humans could be studied, controlled, and erased with terrifying efficiency, all behind the polite veneer of a respected railroad line. Amid the fear and silence, one figure emerged, not by chance, but by sheer determination. Eleanor Hargrove was no longer the timid seamstress who had watched in horror from the station platform. The events of that night had carved a steel edge into her resolve. She could no longer ignore what she had seen. The weight of knowledge demanded action. Eleanor was flawed, yes. She was young, inexperienced, and vulnerable, but those very flaws became her armor. She knew that ordinary courage alone would not suffice. What she needed was cunning, observation, and the willingness to move through shadows without attracting attention. From the moment she decided to investigate, Eleanor became a silent hero in a town that would never recognize her bravery. She kept meticulous notes, sketched diagrams of the train cars, and memorized the schedules and routines of the railroad men. Every step she took was deliberate, every glance calculated. Her home became a planning room, her small attic a map of secrets. By piecing together the patterns, she began to see the method behind the horror. And yet each discovery brought a new layer of fear. If Silas or his associates suspected her understanding, her life could be in immediate danger. But Eleanor's personal stakes were profound. She had watched the vulnerable disappear, she had seen the living become haunted vessels, she had felt the isolation of knowing too much. She realized that saving others, or at least exposing the truth, was the only way to protect her own fragile sense of safety. With that understanding, Eleanor Hargrove transformed from accidental witness to deliberate seeker of justice, and from the shadows of Milford, she began a journey that would test every ounce of her courage and wits. Eleanor knew she could not confront the railroad men openly. That would have been suicide. Instead, she became invisible in plain sight, blending into the rhythm of the station, observing the men who orchestrated the horror with a careful, almost reverent precision. She memorized the timing of each train, the way Harold Greaves moved through the cars, and the subtle signals exchanged between Silas, Jonas, and Marshall. Every gesture, every whispered word was a clue. Eleanor kept a notebook hidden beneath her apron, sketches of compartments and secret panels, every detail that might someday expose the truth. She began asking carefully framed questions to passengers and workers alike, feigning casual curiosity while gathering fragments of information. A remark about a missing parcel here, an unusual schedule change there. Each tiny piece was a puzzle she was determined to solve. The town remained largely oblivious, seeing only a quiet young woman going about her business. But Eleanor had begun to see patterns no one else could. The timing of the empty arrivals, the subtle changes in the passengers who returned, and the quiet complicity of those who knew and looked away. The deeper she went, the more dangerous it became. She noticed guards stationed at strategic points, men who watched the platforms like hawks, their presence a silent warning. And yet Eleanor pressed on, driven by the knowledge that the town would remain blind unless she uncovered the train's secrets. Every night, as the lamps dimmed across Milford, she reviewed her observations, her mind racing to connect cause and effect. She was no longer a bystander. She was an infiltrator, a shadow moving inside the very machinery that had stolen lives, risking everything to reveal what should never have happened. Now I need you to lean in closer, because what comes next is where the story truly turns. Eleanor Hargrove's investigation is no longer a quiet gathering of notes and observations. It's a dangerous dance with men who will stop at nothing to protect their secrets. Every step she takes could be her last. And yet she presses on because the truth demands exposure, and the town of Milford deserves to see what has been hidden in plain sight for far too long. Can you handle what she discovers? Can you imagine standing in a station at night, knowing lives are being erased before your very eyes, and no one else will believe you? This is the point where fear and courage collide, where the ordinary becomes extraordinary, and where silence is more deadly than any bullet. If you're still with me, still breathing with Eleanor, still seeing the shadows that others pretend don't exist, then you are part of this investigation. Comment below if you dare to continue, subscribe to join the search for the truth, and brace yourself. What you are about to witness will linger in your mind long after the train has disappeared into darkness. Eleanor's patience and courage finally yielded a breakthrough. Hidden in a seldom-used freight car at the edge of the station, she found what no one else had seen, a small secret compartment carefully concealed beneath the floorboards, lined with worn straps and locks. Inside were personal effects belonging to the missing passengers, a mother's handkerchief, a farmer's ledger, a child's toy, all perfectly preserved as if frozen in time. The realization hit Eleanor like a physical blow. This was proof, not a whisper, not a rumor, but undeniable evidence that the train's passengers had been intentionally taken, hidden, and erased from their lives. Her hand shook as she documented everything, sketching the layout, noting the locks and latches, and quietly photographing each item by lantern light. She understood with chilling clarity that these were the tangible traces of a horror meticulously orchestrated by men who smiled in daylight while concealing terror behind locked doors. Every item told a story of interrupted life, stolen potential, and unimaginable cruelty. Eleanor felt the weight of responsibility settle over her. She now carried the burden of truth, the undeniable proof that would expose the railroad's secret. But with knowledge came danger, and she knew the moment she left that car she would be hunted, watched, and tested in ways she could scarcely imagine. Eleanor's discovery did not remain secret for long. As she tried to leave the freight yard under the cover of darkness, she sensed movement behind her, footsteps quickening, the hiss of a lantern swinging through the mist. Harold Greaves and two other railroad men had noticed her, and their calm authority was gone, replaced by predatory urgency. Heart pounding, Eleanor ducked into shadows, weaving between crates and barrels, every breath shallow, every sound magnified in the night. The chase was relentless. The whistle of the departing train echoed in the distance, a grim reminder of the lives that had vanished, while the men behind her shouted warnings and threats that cut through the fog. Eleanor's mind raced, mapping escape routes she had memorized, improvising leaps over rails and gaps between storage cars. Fear fueled her legs, but fear alone was not enough. She relied on instinct, memory, and the intimate knowledge of the station's hidden passages she had gathered over weeks of observation. Finally, she burst through a side gate, heart hammering, lungs burning, and ran into the silent streets of Milford. Behind her, the men hesitated, constrained by the law of appearances and fear of drawing attention. Eleanor had survived the pursuit, but the knowledge she carried burned in her hands like fire. She understood this was only the beginning, proof in hand, yet the danger had only intensified. Eleanor did not stop running until she reached the outskirts of Milford. where the town gave way to open fields and the first signs of travelers and merchants moving along distant roads. She carried the evidence with trembling hands, every item wrapped carefully, her sketches and notes clutched like lifelines. She had risked everything to bring the truth to light, yet she soon discovered a cruel irony. Those in power were not only dismissive, they were actively resistant. Local newspapers refused her story, editors claimed it was impossible or unverified, and law enforcement downplayed her claims as the fanciful imagination of a frightened girl. Eleanor realized that exposing the train's horrors would require more than courage. It required persistence, ingenuity, and alliances she had yet to form. The evidence she carried was undeniable, yet no one wanted to believe that trusted railroad men could orchestrate something so monstrous. Even in civilization, she faced a reversal. The world she had thought was safe, rational, and just turned out to be complicit in ignoring the darkness. But Eleanor did not falter. The very resistance she encountered strengthened her resolve. She understood that truth alone could not convince the world. She would have to fight, carefully, strategically, until the horrors of the train were no longer hidden behind steel, shadow, and silence. Months later, with Eleanor's meticulous documentation and courageously gathered proof, a formal raid was finally organized. Authorities, under the guise of a routine inspection, entered the railroad's storage yards and sidings with a sense of grim anticipation, unaware of what awaited them. When they pried open the hidden compartments of the freight cars, the results were horrifying. Items belonging to missing passengers were discovered in neat rows, personal belongings, scraps of clothing, journals, and small toys, preserved in eerie, almost ceremonial order. The smell of damp wood and iron mingled with the faint odor of decay, creating a nauseating, haunting atmosphere. The train cars themselves revealed more than just personal effects. Compartments had been altered, modified to isolate, restrain, and manipulate human occupants with precise cruelty. Walls bore scratches, as if lives had struggled against their confinement, and lanterns hung in strategic positions to confuse and disorient anyone trapped inside. Investigators stumbled backwards, speechless, confronting a scene that defied explanation yet confirmed every fearful suspicion. For Eleanor, standing in that chamber of horrors was a mixture of vindication and horror. She had unearthed the truth, yet the scale of the cruelty left her breathless. What had seemed like a strange, haunting rumor had manifested into tangible, undeniable evidence, and in that moment the town of Milford and the authorities could no longer pretend the darkness did not exist. With the raid complete, the men behind the horror could no longer hide behind polished appearances. Silas Vexler, Jonas Creed, and Marshall Dunn, once respected and admired, were unmasked for the cold, calculating predators they truly were. Silas, with his smooth voice and calm demeanor, revealed a chilling arrogance when confronted, as if the truth of his actions somehow validated his intellect. Jonas, sharp and precise in manner, maintained an icy composure, while Marshall's silence became more menacing than words could convey. Documents recovered from the train offices detailed their methods, scheduling, and the psychological manipulation they had practiced for months, even years. Each page exposed a deliberate pattern of control and cruelty, highlighting not only their technical ingenuity but also the profound moral corruption behind their calm exterior. Witnesses testified to subtle signs they had missed: gestures, hidden compartments, whispers exchanged in the dark, now seen in a new, horrifying light. The unmasking was more than revelation. It was a collapse of the image of authority these men had cultivated. In the eyes of the townspeople, their trust was shattered. Eleanor Hargrove, having risked everything, finally saw the faces of the men who had orchestrated the nightmare she had witnessed, confirming the truth that had haunted her every waking hour. The villains, once untouchable, were now exposed, their control unraveling before the town and the law alike. The raid and the unmasking of the railroad men revealed only a fraction of the horror. As investigators sifted through documents, ledgers, and coded correspondence, it became clear that Milford was not an isolated incident. Silas, Jonas, and Marshall were part of a wider network spanning multiple states, moving passengers, sometimes disappearing, sometimes returning altered, through a meticulously controlled web of rail lines. Kentucky was merely one node in a dark, sprawling operation that reached far beyond the town's borders. Evidence suggested a chilling level of coordination. Schedules, manifests, and secret compartments were standardized across the network, ensuring the system could operate with terrifying precision. Every missing passenger left a trace, every returnee was altered, and every town along the route played an unwitting role in maintaining the facade of normalcy. The organization was part criminal enterprise, part experiment in control and manipulation, a fusion of greed, obsession, and the cold application of science to human lives. For Eleanor and the investigators, the realization was staggering. The scale of the crime made Milford's empty train look like a single thread in a vast, terrifying tapestry. Understanding this network revealed just how carefully the men had insulated themselves from detection and punishment. It also underscored the enormous courage required for anyone to challenge them, and highlighted the extraordinary risk Eleanor had taken simply by witnessing the truth. Even after the evidence was uncovered, Eleanor realized that exposing the horror was only part of the battle. Beyond the men who orchestrated the train's nightmare, there existed a quiet but powerful societal complicity. Local newspapers, wary of upsetting influential rail companies, downplayed the story. Merchants and town leaders dependent on commerce, and the prestige of the railroad turned a blind eye. Rumors were dismissed, witnesses discouraged, and survivors silenced through subtle threats and social pressure. It became clear that Milford and towns like it had been steeped in a conspiracy of silence, where fear and convenience outweighed the moral imperative to confront evil. Even townspeople who had seen or suspected strange events chose inaction, rationalizing their silence as prudence or disbelief. Eleanor recognized that the horror was perpetuated not only by deliberate malice but also by the collective unwillingness to confront uncomfortable truths. The empty train had vanished, but its shadow lingered in every polite nod, every averted gaze, and every whispered excuse. For Eleanor, this revelation was bitter. She understood that the real struggle was not only against the villains but against the societal mechanisms that allowed them to operate unchecked. Courage alone would not suffice. She would need persistence, strategy, and the determination to pierce the veil of collective denial if the story of the train and its victims was ever to be fully acknowledged. The aftermath of the investigation brought justice of a kind, though it was far from complete. Silas Vexler, Jonas Creed, and Marshall Dunn faced formal charges, their names forever tarnished in the public record. Silas, ever calculating, attempted to defend himself with cold logic, claiming that the missing passengers were part of controlled transfers and that any suffering was unintentional. Jonas and Marshall offered little in their own defense, their silence speaking louder than words. The courts, confronted with Eleanor's meticulous documentation and the damning evidence from the hidden compartments, had no choice but to act. Yet justice was complicated. Some of the missing passengers were never recovered. Some who returned bore permanent marks, physical, emotional, and psychological, that would haunt them for life. The railroad network's reach had allowed many threads to vanish into obscurity, and accountability could only extend so far. Meanwhile, Eleanor Hargrove, though lauded quietly by a few who understood her bravery, received no official recognition for her role in unraveling the crime. Her name was whispered in private circles, her courage honored only by those who had witnessed it firsthand. The villains were removed from power, yet their legacy lingered. The town of Milford and the broader network of rail communities remained scarred by what had occurred. Eleanor, burdened with the truth and the memories of those who vanished, understood that some horrors, though confronted, leave shadows that stretch long into the future. The story of Milford's empty train left a legacy that endured far beyond the immediate horror. It became a cautionary tale whispered among rail workers, townspeople, and travelers alike, a reminder that progress and innovation, no matter how celebrated, can conceal terrible danger when left unchecked. Eleanor Hargrove's bravery served as a quiet moral compass, showing that courage, observation, and persistence can pierce the veil of deception, even when the world seems indifferent. The victims, some returned and some lost, became symbols of vulnerability and resilience. Communities learned painfully that trusting appearances could be fatal and that evil often wears the mask of respectability. The societal silence that had allowed the railroad's crimes to flourish was exposed as complicity, teaching future generations the importance of speaking out, questioning authority, and protecting those who cannot protect themselves. Yet the moral is not simple. The train's horror reminds us that evil does not always announce itself and that some systems are designed to hide it in plain sight. Eleanor's story demonstrates that even one individual, armed with courage and meticulous attention to detail, can challenge darkness. Milford never forgot the emptiness that passed through its station, and the tale remains a stark lesson. Vigilance, courage, and conscience are the only shields against those who manipulate fear and control with precision. And now, as we stand together at the edge of this dark tale, I ask you, could something like this happen today? Could a network of secrets, carefully hidden behind the veneer of progress, operate in silence while the world looks the other way? Eleanor Hargrove's courage reminds us that vigilance is not optional, that the shadows exist where we least expect them, and that the truth often comes at a cost. If you followed her journey, if you felt the weight of the empty train, then you know the chilling reality. The horrors of the past are never entirely gone. They linger hidden, waiting for a witness brave enough to see and speak. Share your thoughts below, subscribe to join our ongoing investigations, and become part of the search for truth that stretches across history and geography. Your awareness, your questions, your courage, they matter. And as for what comes next, there is another story, whispered and half forgotten, about a night train in the South that carried a far stranger cargo than even Milford's could hold. A train that left behind secrets darker than anyone imagined. Stay tuned because the next chapter of hidden history is approaching and the shadows are waiting.